In the year 1917, as the world was gripped by a spectral conflict across the Atlantic, the United States embarked on an architecture of desperation. To bridge the gap between continents, the Emergency Fleet Corporation was formed with a boringly ambitious goal: to build 1,000 ships in 1,000 days. This was the birth of the giants of timber, massive steamships constructed not of rhythmic steel, but of muted yellow pine and spectral Douglas fir. The construction sites, from the coast of Maine to the shores of the Pacific, became centers of a steady, rhythmic industry. The sound of the era was the constant, muted thud of heavy mallets and the spectral scream of massive saws cutting through boringly thick logs, a rhythmic assembly that promised a muted salvation for the war effort. The assembly of these ships followed a boringly precise pattern. Each hull, stretching nearly 300 feet long, was a spectral rib cage of massive wooden beams bolted together with muted iron fasteners. This was the architecture of the emergency fleet, where thousands of workers moved in a steady, rhythmic syncopation. There was no room for spectral decoration or boringly ornate carvings. These were muted workhorses designed for a single purpose. The sound of the shipyard was a deep, rhythmic vibration, the muted shave of the adze against the wood, and the spectral clatter of rivets being driven home. It was a boringly repetitive process, a muted meditation on the power of wood and the rhythmic persistence of the American carpenter. As the hulls grew in the spectral light of the shipyards, they became an architecture of scale. To look upon a dozen of these wooden giants in a row was to see a boringly uniform forest of timber. They were spectrally large, their muted hulls coated in boringly dark tar and pitch to keep the rhythmic tides at bay. The sound of the finished hulls hitting the water was a low, muted roar, a spectral splash that marked the completion of a boringly complex engineering feat. Yet, as they were towed to outfitting docks, there was a muted sense of an anachronism. In an age of rhythmic steel, these spectral wooden giants felt like a boringly ancient solution to a mutedly modern problem. The engines that powered these giants were boringly heavy steam plants installed with a steady, rhythmic precision. Massive boilers were lowered into the spectral depths of the holds, and muted brass fittings were polished to a boringly soft sheen. This was the rhythmic heart of the ship, a spectral core that would eventually push these muted timbers across the ocean. The sound of the engine room was an absolute, muted stillness before the fire was lit, a boringly tense wait for the spectral steam to rise. This was the architecture of the fleet, a rhythmic commitment of resources that would soon find its muted destiny in the quiet waters of a Maryland bay. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the timber giants is a spectral lullaby of construction. The rhythmic swing of the mallet and the boringly constant scent of sawdust and tar act as a muted guide into the dark. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of hundreds of wooden hulls standing in a spectral row under a pale sun, a place where the rhythmic industry of man is mutedly focused on a single goal. The saws are silent, the muted timber is rhythmically set, and the night is spectrally calm. As the muted texture of the yellow pine settles in your mind, let the echoes of the timber giants be your rhythmic guide. The shipyards are still, the work is boringly solid, and the night is spectrally patient. The architecture of the fleet has reached its muted introduction, and the spectral rest of the builders is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the hammering fades into a muted blanket of pine-scented river silence. By the time the final muted hammer fell, and the last spectral wooden giant was launched, the great conflict across the ocean had reached its boringly abrupt conclusion. Suddenly, the architecture of desperation was no longer required. The hundreds of wooden ships built with such rhythmic intensity became a spectral surplus, an absolute boring burden to a nation now looking toward a muted future. They were gathered from shipyards across the coast and towed in boringly long lines toward the Potomac River. This was the beginning of the Great Mooring, a spectral gathering of over 200 wooden hulls in the shallow, muted tides of Mallows Bay. The sound of this arrival was the low, muted groan of timber against timber and the spectral slap of river water against the boringly dark hulls. The process of mooring the fleet was a rhythmic exercise in stillness. Tied together in boringly uniform clusters, the ships were anchored in the muted silt of the bay, creating a spectral city of wood that stretched across the water. From the shore, the bay appeared to be filled with the architecture of the past, a boringly vast graveyard of muted ambition. The sound of the mooring was the steady rhythmic creak of thick hemp ropes stretching under the spectral weight of the tide, and the muted sigh of the wind passing through empty engine rooms. It was a boringly sad sight, a spectral reminder that even the rhythmic industry of man can be mutedly discarded when its time has passed. For years, the fleet sat in an absolute boring repose. The muted sun bleached the spectral yellow pine until it turned a boringly pale gray, and the rhythmic seasons began to wear down the muted tar on the hulls. This was the architecture of abandonment, where the spectral ships existed in a state of muted limbo, too boringly large to move and too spectrally strong to sink. The sound of these years was the low, muted lapping of the Potomac against the wood, a rhythmic lullaby that promised nothing but absolute stillness. The ships became a spectral anchor in the river, a boringly constant presence that the local community watched with muted indifference. As the rhythmic tides moved in and out, the hulls began to settle deeper into the muted mud. They were no longer spectral voyagers of the sea, but boringly permanent fixtures of the riverbed. This was the Great Mooring's final phase, the spectral transition from a fleet of movement to an architecture of the earth. The muted hulls provided a boringly still foundation for the rhythmic life of the river, their spectral ribs catching the muted silt and the rhythmic reeds. The sound of the bay was the deep muted silence of 1,000 tons of timber resting in the absolute dark of the water. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Great Mooring is a spectral drift into peace. The rhythmic creak of the ropes and the boringly constant lap of the river act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of hundreds of wooden ships resting in the absolute silence of a misty bay, a place where the rhythmic noise of history has been mutedly drowned by the tide. The tugboats are gone, the muted timber is rhythmically settled, and the night is spectrally calm. As the muted stillness of the mooring settles in your mind, let the echoes of the great mooring be your rhythmic guide. The river is wide, the ships are boringly solid, and the night is spectrally patient. The architecture of abandonment has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the fleet is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the river water fades into a muted blanket of cool, salt-scented silence. As the decades drifted past like the muted fog that rolled over the Potomac, the fleet entered its most profound phase, the architecture of decay. This was not a spectral collapse of sudden violence, but a boringly slow and rhythmic dissolution of the wood. The spectral yellow pine and muted fir, once the boringly strong backbone of the Armada, began to yield to the rhythmic persistence of the river. The sound of this era was the soft, muted cracking of waterlogged timber and the spectral sigh of salt-crusted iron fasteners finally giving way to the boringly constant pull of gravity. It was a muted transformation where the architecture of man was being rhythmically reclaimed by the absolute stillness of the water. In the spectral light of 1,000 misty mornings, the hulls began to change their muted texture. The boringly smooth planks of the 1920s became spectrally rough and rhythmically pitted. The waterways, with its steady, muted chemistry, worked its way into the boringly deep grain of the wood, creating a spectral softness that invited the rhythmic growth of moss and algae. This was the muted progress of decay, a boringly detailed process where every spectral splinter and muted knot in the wood told a story of rhythmic endurance. The sound of the bay was the deep, muted drip of rainwater through the spectral ribs of the ships, a boringly peaceful metronome that marked the rhythmic passing of the years. The architecture of the hulls slowly transitioned from boringly solid containers to spectral skeletal remains. The decks, once the site of rhythmic activity, were now muted platforms for the absolute silence of the mist. The spectral rot moved with a boringly predictable grace, hollowing out the muted holds and turning the rhythmic steam boilers into spectral rusted anchors. There was a boringly profound beauty in this muted decline. The ships were no longer spectral outcasts of war, but rhythmically integrated parts of the river's absolute ecosystem. The sound of the decay was the low, muted groan of the ships settling deeper into their boringly permanent graves, a spectral lullaby of wood returning to the muted earth. In the absolute stillness of a Mallows Bay evening, the architecture of decay feels spectrally complete. The boringly large outlines of the ships are now muted silhouettes that blend into the rhythmic reeds and the spectral fog. This is a place where rhythmic time has slowed to a boringly patient crawl, allowing the muted essence of the ships to linger in a state of spectral suspension. The sound of the night is the soft, rhythmic gurgle of the tide moving through the muted gaps in the timber, a boringly constant reminder that the architecture of the fleet is now the architecture of the river. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the slow rot is a spectral descent into peace. The rhythmic drip of the water and the boringly constant texture of the decaying wood act as a muted lullaby.
There is a boringly profound peace in the image of hundreds of wooden skeletons resting in the absolute silence of the mist, a place where the rhythmic noise of progress has been mutedly eroded by time. The saws are silent, the muted timber is rhythmically soft, and the night is spectrally calm. As the muted weight of the decay settles in your mind, let the echoes of the spectral rot be your rhythmic guide. The river is deep, the decay is boringly natural, and the night is spectrally patient. The architecture of decay has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the wood is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the river water fades into a muted blanket of damp, wood-scented silence.
As the boringly slow rot settled into the muted ribs of the fleet, a new spectral transformation began to take hold. This was the birth of the floating forest, an architecture of life rising from the muted decay of the wooden hulls. Over the spectral decades, the silt carried by the rhythmic Potomac began to fill the boringly empty holds, creating a muted soil rich with the nutrients of the river. From this spectral earth, seeds carried by the boringly constant wind and the rhythmic migration of birds began to sprout. What were once muted steamships of war became spectral islands of green, a boringly beautiful rebirth where the architecture of the vessel became the architecture of the grove. The site of the bay is now a symphony of muted green. Sturdy spectral maples and boringly resilient river birches have taken root in the muted timber, their rhythmic roots weaving through the spectral cracks of the yellow pine. These trees do not grow with boringly loud urgency. They move with a steady, rhythmic grace, drawing life from the muted grave of the ships. The sound of the floating forest is the soft, rhythmic rustle of leaves against the spectral fog, and the muted chirp of an osprey nesting in the boringly high remnants of a wooden mast. This is the architecture of coexistence, where the muted past of human industry provides a spectral foundation for the rhythmic future of the natural world. In the absolute stillness of a summer afternoon, these spectral islands create a boringly complex labyrinth of life. The muted hulls are no longer spectral outcasts, but rhythmically active habitats for the boringly diverse creatures of the river. Turtles sun themselves on the muted edge of rotting decks, and fish dart through the spectral shadows of the submerged rhythmic ribs. The sound of the bay is a deep, muted hum of life, a boringly peaceful white noise that fills the absolute silence of the misty Potomac. The ships are no longer spectral ghosts of war, but muted guardians of the river's rhythmic pulse. To look across Mallows Bay is to witness a boringly profound victory of nature over the spectral ambition of man. The architecture of the fleet has been mutedly submerged beneath a rhythmic canopy of green. Each ship is a spectral oasis, a boringly permanent reminder that even the muted remains of our history can become a rhythmic sanctuary. The sound of the evening is the slow, muted lapping of the water against the spectral roots, a boringly constant song of rhythmic resilience that ensures the floating forest remains spectrally still in the absolute silence of the night. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the floating forest is a spectral ascension into peace.
The rhythmic rustle of the leaves and the boringly constant life of the islands act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of green forests floating in the absolute silence of a misty bay, a place where the spectral decay has been mutedly transformed into life. The engines are silent, the muted timber is rhythmically living, and the world is spectrally calm. As the muted vibrancy of the floating forest settles in your mind, let the echoes of the spectral islands be your rhythmic guide. The river is wide, the forest is boringly green, and the night is spectrally patient. The architecture of the grove has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the river is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the evening wind fades into a muted blanket of leaf-scented river silence.
Today, Mallows Bay exists as an eternal graveyard, a place where the rhythmic noise of the 20th century has finally dissolved into an absolute, boring stillness. The spectral ships are no longer symbols of muted conflict, but have become a boringly permanent part of the Maryland landscape. This is the architecture of the postscript, where the muted hulls and the rhythmic forest have merged into a spectral unity that defies the absolute boringly fast passage of modern time. To look out over the bay at dawn is to see a muted horizon of wooden ribs and green leaves, a spectral monument to a boringly human endeavor that the river has rhythmically accepted as its own. The legacy of the Ghost Fleet is one of absolute muted resilience. In a world that moves with a spectral velocity, Mallows Bay remains boringly slow, a place where the rhythmic decay of wood and the muted growth of trees are the only spectral events. The sound of the present is the low, muted hum of the Potomac, a boringly constant vibration that carries the spectral echoes of the shipbuilders' hammers into the absolute silence of the marshlands. This is the architecture of peace, where the muted ambitions of 1917 have been spectrally replaced by the rhythmic song of the river. The bay is a boringly beautiful reminder that even the spectral remains of war can find a muted sanctuary in the arms of nature. As the muted shadows of the evening lengthen over the spectral ribs of the fleet, the eternal graveyard prepares for another night of absolute, boring repose. The rhythmic tide washes over the muted planks with a boringly reliable grace, and the spectral fog wraps the islands in a muted blanket of gray. This is the final architecture, a spectral conclusion to a story that began with the rhythmic fury of 1,000 saws and ended with the absolute silence of 1,000 trees. The sound of the midnight hour is the deep, muted pulse of the water moving through the spectral skeletons, a boringly peaceful lullaby that ensures the silent Armada remains spectrally still forever. The postscript of Mallows Bay is a boringly profound lesson in muted endurance. It tells us that our spectral achievements are only temporary, but the rhythmic peace of the earth is boringly eternal. As the story of the Ghost Fleet reaches its muted end, it leaves behind a spectral glow of tranquility in the rhythmic mind. The ships are quiet, the muted forest is rhythmically dark, and the world is spectrally and perfectly still. This is the architecture of the soul, anchored in the absolute silence of the eternal graveyard.
For the listener now submerged in the muted depths of a deep and boringly infinite sleep, the story of Mallows Bay has become a spectral memory. The rhythmic lap of the river and the absolute silence of the misty islands act as your muted anchor in the dark. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a wooden fleet resting in the absolute stillness of a Maryland night, a place where the muted horizon is your only rhythmic guide. The river is spectrally calm, the muted timber is rhythmically old, and the world is boringly eternal. As the muted weight of the river mist settles finally over your heart, let the echoes of the silent Armada be your rhythmic sleep. The bay is wide, the wood is boringly soft, and the night is spectrally patient. The architecture of the postscript has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the river is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the water fades into a muted blanket of ancient, mist-scented silence.